You know, bookstore people have the best job there is. Not only do we get to read some really good books, but sometimes we get to meet the wonderful person who wrote the book. Today is no exception. I found this book, Letters from Berlin. Right here's the book. It's a beautiful book. I found it to be fascinating. It sells for $24.95, and you can pick up a copy here and get it signed and then pay on your way out downstairs. It's the story of Kerstin Lieff's mother, Margarete Taos, and her grandmother, Helga, and their lives from the other side as Germans in World War II. Margarete's daughter, Kerstin Lieff, was born to Margarete Taos and Jürgen Moller in Stockholm, Sweden in the winter of 1952, just after her parents had fled their German homeland. 10 months later, the family immigrated to St. Paul, Minnesota. Kerstin's mother died in 2005 at the age of 81, not long after reciting her life story, which led to the writing of Letters from Berlin. Kerstin now lives in Boulder, Colorado. You know, when I finish a book, I always try to think, what can I take with me from this book? This was a deep, thought-provoking book, and I knew personally that I'd learned some valuable lessons from it. Let me just take just a second to share them with you, just some of them with you. First, even in the darkest times of my life, I have never experienced such horrible circumstances as Greta and Helga, along with the thousands of others during the time of the war. And that kind of leads to the second lesson. Don't agonize over the past. These people put it behind them, and they went on to live valuable, productive lives. And third, and it's a quote from Greta's letters, what is astonishing, though, is the human will, which, regardless of the fight, continues to hold its head high. Letters from Berlin, a story of war, survival, and the redeeming power of love and friendship. Please, let's give Kerstin Lieff a warm Moby Dickens welcome.
So much, all of you, for coming. I feel honored to be here, and I actually love being here at Taos. It's such a wonderful place. And I also want to say thank you, especially to those people who I know would rather be skiing this afternoon after that beautiful snowstorm yesterday. I also want to say that I'm really honored on behalf of my mother that you're here listening, those of you who've read my book or want to read my book. These stories are all her stories, and she died believing that there would be no one in the world who would ever want to hear her stories. And the reason is because she was German. And she was German, she was from the side of the war that had perpetrated all those atrocities we all know so much about, the side of the war that had started it as well. And so her life and what she experienced always remained sort of secret inside of her. She is the narrator of my book. She's also the co-author. And although the book was written after she died, I still call her the co-author because they really are all her stories. They were translated from the German, transcribed, put into this book. And then, in fact, she actually is a part of an author in the book, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So my name is Kerstin Lieff. I'm going to spend maybe the next 45 minutes talking about my book, reading from it. I'll leave plenty of time for questions, so if you have them, keep them in mind. I'd love to share with you as much as I know. My family immigrated to the United States in 1953, and I was 10 months old when we came over. We were a pretty typical immigrant family. Can everybody hear me in the back? Am I speaking? Okay, loud enough. You know, we were typical in that we spoke our native language at home. German was my first language. We had German food. I mean, God forbid, my mother made me wear dirndl dresses growing up. But we were not that different from the rest of America, American immigrant families, except for that I grew up with this sense that there was something different about my family. And in fact, it was that there was something wrong with my family. We grew up in a small town in southern Minnesota. We were so hungry during the war. But in Russia, it was worse. I never understood what that meant. How did you get to Russia? There were stories of hiding in the bomb shelter all night long as a schoolgirl and not being able to sleep at all because the bombs are falling, and then coming out in the morning and needing to go to school after not having had any sleep, and seeing that the entire neighborhood is gone in smoke, flames, and then getting to school and finding that her best friend will never, ever come back to school again. But it wasn't until my mother was in her late 70s. She had left Minnesota and moved to Boulder, Colorado, which is where I live too. And I had asked her then, I was already an adult too, but I said to her, you really need to share your stories because they're so different. And what a shame it would be if your life was lived in vain and your stories went to your grave with you. And she didn't answer. She didn't really say anything, and I really expected her to say, we don't talk about those things. Those days were too horrible, and we're in America now. This is what she always explained. We're in America now, life is good. We don't need to talk about those days. What happened was 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from her, and she said, I've been thinking about your request. I've been thinking about it really hard, and I've made my decision. I've decided I'm going to tell you my life stories, but I'm only going to tell you once. I think I can handle once. I don't think I can do any more than that, so you better listen well. So I bought a tape recorder. I ended up buying hundreds of cassette tapes. We ended up spending 3 years together, a time during which we had breakfast at her house every Sunday, and she talked and I tape recorded, and she told stories, and she told funny stories and sad stories and horrifying stories and love stories. And during that time, we also traveled back to Germany. And she showed me Berlin, she showed me where her house had been, she showed me the Lazarett. The translation is field hospital, and in this case it was an urban field hospital where wounded soldiers were cared for. And then we also went to the beautiful medieval town in northern Germany called Jena. She went to university there. It's the same university where Schiller and Goethe had taught once. Unfortunately, the entire city was flattened by Allied bombs, but it's been rebuilt to look exactly the way it used to. I hope that her stories will inspire you as much as they have me, and I'm even going to share with you a little bit about how it's changed my life, even, this process of having gone through talking to her about her life. In fact, over the months now that I've traveled and talked with people, it's come up so much how valuable and important not history but story is. The story of our family, the oral history of how many people have come to me and said, I want to do this. I want to interview my uncle, my grandmother, my aunt, because they have stories to tell. And I think that's one of the greatest things that I've learned out of this. So I'll tell you a little bit about Margarete. Her name was also Grete, short for Margarete. She was born in 1924. That means that in 1933, when Hitler came to power, she was 9 years old. So surely she really didn't know what the hushed conversations meant that went on in her home. She did get a sense that her father was very upset about the new regime and about the new leader. Later, with a stepfather. Her father had died. They moved to Berlin, and as a teenager, she grows up in the city. And here's the first place where she personally recognizes the hypocrisy of the regime that she lives under. One of her best friends, Hilde, who's half Jewish, tells her one day that she's not allowed to join the BDM. It's the German version of the Girl Scouts, because her mother's Jewish. And Hilde's brother announces one day that he is allowed to fight in the German army, which indeed he does. But he's told one day that he's not allowed to join or to go to the officer training school. My mother also witnesses Kristallnacht. It's what we call the night of broken glass now, the night where she looks out her parlor room window and she sees the SS smash the front window of the Jewish shop. It's a leather shop across the street. And she hears them screaming at the couple. And she sees them, get dragged out of their house. And the only thing that she knows to think at the time is that these people must have done something very, very wrong. The war is over. She's 19. She's working as a Red Cross nurse in Berlin. And then, duped by the Russians, she ends up in a gulag in Siberia.